The Ladder of Divine Ascent, an ascetic treatise by Abba John, abbot of the monks of Mount Sinai, sent by him to Abba John, abbot of Raithu, at whose request it was written. Step 1. On Renunciation of the World. Η αποταγή του κόσμου. Renunciation, in the Greek text, is the word αποταγή. Αποταγή in Greek is seen primarily in two contexts. The first is a legal context in which someone renounces their inheritance. They break from their family and the inheritance due them, and they choose something else. Αποταγή, in the second context in which it's seen, and primarily in Kini Greek, is in the early sacramental life of the Christians, who use this word when speaking about the renunciation of Satan before the baptism. People who were to become Christians and become baptized before the baptism proper use these words to renounce the devil before they turn then to Christ. Step 1, verse 3. God belongs to all free beings. He is the life of all, the salvation of all, faithful and unfaithful, just and unjust, pious and impious, passionate and dispassionate, monks and seculars, wise and simple, healthy and sick, young and old. Just as the diffusion of light, the sight of the sun, and the changes of the weather are for all alike, for there is no respect of persons with God. Our God is, and we respond to him, but he does not change in nature or in goodness. And so, like the light of the sun, he's there to dawn on us and on the world, regardless of our own posture towards him. Verse 4. The irreligious man is a mortal being with a rational nature, who of his own free will turns his back on life and thinks of his own Maker, the ever-existent, as non-existent. Here we see St. John speaking about people who are irreligious, who decide, who turn their back on God, and led by their heart, then convince their minds of his non-existence, and they don't busy themselves with things beyond this world. Quote, the lawless man is one who holds the law of God after his own depraved fashion, and thinks to combine faith in God with heresy that is directly opposed to him. End quote. Here, St. John speaks of those of us who accept some parts of God and reject others, who take the law of God and then tailor it to our own fashion, who walk with God as far as is comfortable for us, and who abandon him and stop walking with him as soon as it goes against our own current desires. And we choose, instead, we commit heresy. That is, we choose rather than listen to God. Quote, the Christian is one who imitates Christ in thought, word, and deed, as far as is possible for human beings, believing rightly and blamelessly in the Holy Trinity. And here we see the essence of what it is to be Christian. The first step and simple explanation of the Christian life is one who imitates Christ in thought, in word, and deed. And to imitate Christ in thought is not something we hear of perhaps as often as to imitate him in word and deed. But as we read St. John of the Ladder, we will see that the inner world, too, can be transformed towards the light of Christ. Quote, "The lover of God is he who lives in communion with all that is natural and sinless, and as far as he is able neglects nothing good." And so those who love God will strive to live in communion with what's natural to their human nature, not their fallen state, but rather to what a human is meant to be. And they'll strive to avoid things that are sinful and to attain to the virtues, not to neglect what is good, but rather to strive to spend life, as a friend I have says, polishing their soul. Quote, "The continent man is he who in the midst of temptations, snares, and turmoil strives with all his might to imitate the ways of him who is free from such." And so there's already a small measure of virtue. St. John calls someone continent even as they're struggling in temptations, perhaps even in base temptations. But the struggling and striving to imitate Christ, who is free from these temptations, who has overcome these temptations in his human nature, is in itself a laudable contest. Quote, "A monk is a morning soul that both asleep and awake is unceasingly occupied with the remembrance of death. Withdrawal from the world is voluntary hatred of vaunted material things, and denial of nature for the attainment of what is above nature." And here, St. John tells us some aspects of the monastic life that apply to all Christians, and that is to have a morning soul, not in the negative sense, but to remember when we're awake and even when we're asleep that at some point our life here on this world will end. And so to use our time here in a future-oriented way, in a way that will help us and guide us to eternity. Quote, "Withdrawal from the world is voluntary hatred of vaunted material things, and denial of nature for attainment of what is above nature." And here, St. John tells us a definition of apotagi, of withdrawal or renunciation from the world. It is on the one hand to hate the things that are held up as valuable in this world, to see through them, to understand that they are temporary, and it is also to deny our own nature, the things that to us seem natural and easy, in order to attain what is above nature. It's natural for us to love those who love us. It is above nature to love those who hate us. Quote, "Those of us who wish to go out of Egypt and to fly from Pharaoh certainly need some Moses as a mediator with God and from God, who, standing between action and contemplation, will raise hands of prayer for us to God, so that guided by him we may cross the sea of sin and rout the Amalek of the passions. That is why those who have surrendered themselves to God deceive themselves if they suppose that they have no need of a director. Those who came out of Egypt had Moses as their guide, and those who fled from Sodom had an angel. The former are like those who are healed of the passions of the soul by the care of physicians. These are they who come out of Egypt. The latter are like those who long to put off the uncleanness of the wretched body. That is why they need a helper, an angel, so to speak, or at least one equal to an angel. For in proportion to the corruption of our wounds, we need a director who is indeed an expert and a physician. And here St. John explains to us one of the basic and most important tenets of the spiritual life, which is not to do it alone, but rather to have the humility to seek someone who has already progressed beyond where we are. This person is our spiritual father or mother, and they will guide us, and not only guide us, but pray for us. Just as Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, so our spiritual Father will guide us out of the slavery to our passions and to the promised land of communion, of union with Christ. Quote, "Those who aim at ascending with the body to heaven need violence indeed, and constant suffering, especially in the early stages of their renunciation, until our pleasure-loving dispositions and unfeeling hearts attain to love of God and chastity by visible sorrow. If we wish to reach heaven, we need to experience a sort of death before the resurrection. And St. John of Climacus tells us that this death is a bit more intense and more painful in the beginning. The early stages of our renunciation, of our turning from the world, will consist of doubt, in which we wonder the things that we've known, the things that have brought us pleasure, and the things that we've used to comfort ourselves, however effectively or not. As we leave these things, we wonder what's on the other side. And it can feel for a moment like we're swinging between branches, like Tarzan. We've let go of one, and as we're waiting for our hand to grasp the next one, we hang in midair. And so, until our own dispositions and our hearts are softened and understand the true and superior joy that a life of love for God and chastity hold, we experience sorrow. Quote, "But let those who are weak and passionate have the courage to offer our infirmity and natural weakness to Christ with unhesitating faith, and confess it to Him, and we shall be certain to obtain His help, even beyond our merit, if only we unceasingly go right down to the depth of humility." And here St. John tells us what to do in the face of the sorrow and the doubt as we begin to turn from the world and to turn towards God. He tells us to offer our infirmity, to offer that sorrow and doubt, our natural weakness to Christ, to show it to Him, to confess it to Him, and certainly to confess it in the context of confession, the sacrament as well. And so, in our own show of humility, and our own show, and in admitting ourselves to God, that we don't yet love Him as we should, He will see our humility and He will send comfort. Quote, "Those who enter this contest," that's the spiritual contest, "must renounce all things, despise all things, deride all things, and shake off all things, that they may lay a firm foundation." And so we see the importance of giving our entire self and our entire life to God. We can't keep some things some things of the world that we're unwilling to give up. We can't decorate our room on the one hand with things of heaven, and on the other hand with things of earth. But we must rather whitewash the walls. We have to start completely empty. And in that emptiness, God will lay a firm foundation. Quote, a good foundation of 3 layers and 3 pillars is innocence, fasting, and temperance. Let all babes in Christ begin with these virtues, taking as their model the natural babes. For you never find in them anything sly or deceitful. They have no insatiate appetite, no insatiable stomach, no body on fire. But perhaps as they grow, in proportion as they take more food, their natural passions also increase. Here, St. John tells us 3 foundational exercises: innocence, fasting, and temperance. Things that he says come natural to newborn babies. Of course, we understand they're innocent and they're not falling prey to their own thoughts and emotions, but rather they take the world as it's given to them. They have a humble posture in which they seek to learn, not simply to analyze and to judge, but rather to learn. Somehow babies are aware that they're not the center of the universe. And their bodies have not yet learned to eat beyond what they need. And so naturally they fast. They cry when they need milk, but once they have it, they rest. Then they don't ask for more, nor do they worry about stocking their fridge or freezer for the next time they need some. And of course, they're naturally tempered. Their innocent hearts don't seek to use their body in a way that will abuse their body, but they're naturally inclined to health and to a healthy relationship with their own body. Quote, to lag in the fight at the very outset of the struggle, and thereby to furnish proof of our coming defeat, is a very hateful and dangerous thing. A firm beginning will certainly be useful for us when we later grow slack. A soul that is strong at first, but then relaxes, is spurred on by the memory of its former zeal, and in this way new wings are often obtained. And so we shouldn't be shy to jump into our spiritual life and to come at it with zeal, and we shouldn't be ashamed to have zeal simply because we're beginners. Because as St. John of Climacus tells us, that zeal that we have in the beginning will be helpful for us. It will be the wings that lift us out of despair when we understand that we've fallen away from it. We'll look back on how we were in the beginning of our spiritual life, and we'll pray to God to renew our zeal and our love for Him. Quote, the man who renounces the world from fear is like burning incense that begins with fragrance but ends in smoke. He who leaves the world through hope of reward is like a millstone that always moves in the same way. But he who withdraws from the world out of love for God has obtained fire at the very outset, and like fire set to fuel, it soon kindles a larger fire. And so we see motivations for leaving the world and following Christ. One is fear, and fear, St. John says, is like incense. In the beginning it seems good, it gives off a fragrance. But at the end, incense, if you've ever watched it, it becomes nothing but ash. It ends in smoke and ash. And so in our own spiritual life, if we're motivated by fear, The fear will at first give us energy to do things that seem to us to be good, but it will be empty. And at the end, it will turn bad. The fragrance will turn to ill-smelling smoke. If we leave the world in hope of reward, St. John says we'll be like a millstone that always moves in the same way. And what he means here is that we will always be turning around ourselves. We set off, we say, on a spiritual journey to find God, to grow close to Him, and yet it's all self-focused. We wonder what rewards He has in store for us, how He will reward our righteousness. And so we've never actually really left the place we started. We stand there turning around ourselves like a millstone, and we never move forward. And he who withdraws from the world out of love for God has obtained fire at the very outset. And here we see St. John revealing to us that it's love of God that should move us to renounce the world. Our renunciation of the world is not a negative thing, but rather a positive thing. And our love for God is like fire. And as fire touches fuel, it spreads. And so if we leave the world because we love God and we move towards heaven out of love for Him, our zeal will compound, our joy will compound, and He'll carry us quickly towards Him.